programme. We're going to move on to focus now, though, in fact, because it's the end of one chapter and the beginning of a new one for Cuba. The country's assembly set to elect a new president later for a new 5-year mandate. Raul Castro, who remains head of the country's only party, the Communist Party, stepping down from his role as head of state after serving 2 5-year mandates. It's the end of a 59-year reign by the Castro brothers, as well as for a whole generation of revolutionaries. We take a look back at the past 60 years with Christophe Danset, Marie Schuster and James Vasina.
It's 1957 in the Sierra Maestra, a mountainous region of Cuba, and a couple of men are preparing for a revolution. They go by the names of Fidel and Raul Castro, 2 brothers, or Ernesto Guevara, more commonly known as Che. Their aim is to overthrow Batista's dictatorship, and they've got the backing of the island's poorer population, who are demanding a redistribution of wealth. On the 8th of January 1959, the revolutionaries receive a warm welcome in Havana, where they're greeted as liberators.
Fidel Castro and his guerrilla soldiers arrived on horses with their beards and chains around their necks. They were very young back then, between 28 and 30 years old, so yes, they were met with great enthusiasm by the crowds.
The new rulers don't wait long to bring about reforms, nationalizing large private properties and sugar plantations. US companies pack up and leave, whilst many from the upper middle class flee to Florida. It marks a complete separation from Washington as the US cuts ties with Havana by imposing an embargo and seizing fuel supplies. But the fight against Castro doesn't end there. Backed by the United States, the Bay of Pigs invasion attempted to overthrow the regime, and it was a fiasco. In reality, the US underestimated the importance of this revolution and the wave of nationalism that was sweeping through Cuba.
At first, the US had no doubt that the operation would be successful. They were confident that the Cubans would rise up in support of the military intervention, establish a temporary government and get rid of Fidel Castro. It's the exact opposite that took place. It was a failure, and Fidel Castro, who at the time was strongly backed by a large majority of Cubans, was the big winner.
Cuba was desperate to find a new commercial and strategic partner, as over 80% of the country's economy depended on trade with the United States. And Fidel Castro partnered with Nikita Khrushchev in the USSR. Khrushchev deployed missiles to Cuba, only 150 kilometers from the coast of the US. A Third World War was avoided, but not by far. After a power struggle, Moscow dismantled its missile bases, and in exchange Washington gave up plans to invade the island. An economic alliance was reached.
The Soviets would sell their oil to Cuba at a much lower price than the market rate. Meanwhile, Cubans would export their sugar at a much higher price than the market rate. So Cuba depended on an economy that was, for the larger part, subsidized.
For the next 30 years, Cuba sponged off the USSR, and the standard of living began to improve considerably. Literacy levels soared, with access to schools, and healthcare was made free of charge. But meanwhile, freedom of expression was limited, and several of the country's intellectuals were locked up.
It was an oppressive time, an authoritarian regime with very intolerant rulers. When you talk to intellectuals and scholars, you realize this was a time of great censorship in books and elsewhere.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba's economy took the biggest plunge in the country's history. In August of 1994, 40,000 Cubans risked their lives fleeing to the US.
In those years, there were no more traffic lights. They didn't have enough fuel to produce electricity. Here in tropical Cuba, food was rotting inside fridges. These were very difficult times for the Cuban people.
Once again, the country was in need of a new ally, and at the end of the 1990s, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, with the largest oil reserves in the world, leaped to its rescue.
At this point, a new exchange program was put in place whereby Venezuela would export fuel at a very low price. And this was very beneficial to Cuba. But 15 years later, this exchange ended.
In the meantime, Fidel Castro fell ill and progressively handed over the leading of the country to his lifelong comrade, his brother Raul. The younger brother began new talks with the US, but most of all, Raul Castro made significant economic reforms. Certain jobs were privatized, but not key sectors of the economy, wreaking havoc to the social structure.
There's tremendous inequality between workers from the private and public sectors. Those from the private sector are earning far more, and paradoxically, the more educated doctors, teachers, engineers who are forced to work in the public sector are earning much less than those other Cubans.
Today, a new chapter begins in Cuba. Fidel Castro died 2 years ago, and as Raul Castro leaves his position as head of state, it's the end of an entire revolutionary generation, leaving behind it a very complicated political and economical situation.
It's our special focus report there for you. Christophe Donset, Marie Schuster and James Vasina reporting. More news coming up right after the break. Do stay with us.